things: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the part of one parable that we don't hear today, and that's the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And these parables are marked with a significant shift in emotion from the grumbling and anger of the Pharisees to the joy that occurs with the person that finds what is lost, and the joy that happens in heaven. And so Jesus is sitting and eating with those in society that are marginalized, off to the edges, those that are considered unworthy to be in his presence. Unworthy, particularly by the opinion of the Pharisees and the scribes. Because having a meal with someone implies acceptance. And that is making the scribes and the Pharisees grumble a lot. And so Jesus reacts to his greatest critics by telling 3 of the parables. Each are different in detail, but they have the same message woven through each one of them. And that message at its most basic level is this: we are to be joyous and celebrate a life restored to Christ, rather than to be resentful that the restored person is deserving of that. That is, the restored person is somehow not worthy or deserving of God's grace and mercy. So the tax collectors and sinners, they come to listen to Jesus. They know they haven't been living right. The tax collectors have been stealing. They know they need what Jesus has, and so they come to his side because they know Jesus can make things different for them. Their hearts and minds are ready and open to receive the word of Christ. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they're the complete opposite to that. They have no godly love. They only have harsh judgment. And they're consumed by resentment. The fact that Jesus would share his time with people they feel is unworthy, they're resenting that. How can he share something so precious with people that don't deserve it? That's what they're upset about. They are filled with resentment, and that's deeply troubling to them. That Jesus is sharing what he has with the wrong people. And so to address the issue, Jesus shares these 3 consecutive parables. The first part of the first 2 parables that we heard read today ask, what is the value of what is lost? What is the value of the lost sheep? What is the value of the lost coin? Basically, what is the value of a lost soul? And that's the question that the parables are going to answer. So if we had 100 sheep grazing on a hill, and the very best one of the herd, of the fold, went away, how much effort would we go in to find that? To leave the 99 left alone in the wilderness to fend for themselves? Would we actually go after that one? If the one that's missing and is lost is the weakest of the herd, are we going to put in the same effort? The weakest one, the one who has mangy fur, who is limping, who's weak. Are we going to put as much effort into going to find that sheep as the one that is the prize of the fold? Or are we just going to leave the weakest one for food for the coyotes? And then the parable of the lost coin sets the stage in a similar manner. Is our effort and desire to find the lost coin the same regardless if it's a $100 coin or a dime? Will we put in the same effort to find what is lost? And Jesus is seeking out and sharing his table, sharing a meal with tax collectors and sinners, and says he's fully willing to look with as much zeal for the weakest, mangiest sheep as he is the prize of the fold. He's willing and able to look as hard for the $100 coin as he is the dime. He's willing to look for us with as much zeal for each and every one of us. Because everyone in God's view has the same value. There's no one greater than the other. We all have the same value. And we're all worth looking for and reaching out to. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they don't see it that way. So these parables really shine a light on the difference between our human nature and God's nature. How we value things through our human eyes and how God values us. And so there's this balance and this contrast of what God's nature is compared to our human nature. So the second half of both of these parables is how we're to respond when the lost is found. And again, that contrasts our human nature and God's nature. The Pharisees are grumbling with resentment while God is rejoicing with this unrestrained joy. When we think of the third parable that we don't hear today, that's the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son, we think of the older brother at the end of that story with absolute resentment for the younger son coming home who's lived a desolate life, and he's the one that gets the party. Jesus says to his greatest critics, don't you know when you're to respond in joy? Don't you know what causes joy in heaven? That releases joy in heaven and earth? Why are you consumed with resentment when you should be over the moon with joy? It says in our scripture, it says, hear how many times the word rejoice is used. It says, when he has found his sheep, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. And then in the second parable, when she had found the coin, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost. Both of these parables also end with very similar statements. It says, just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. And then the second one says, just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. How do we respond when someone is found, has come back to Christ? How do we respond? How we see our value and how God sees our value is different. We have greater value in God's eyes than we do in each other's eyes. For God, our value is infinite. There is great joy in heaven when one is returned to the community of Christ. In each of those parables, everyone is called to gather, to rejoice. It's a relationship. It's back into community, that we're not alone, that we're being brought back. And so I made a comment at the beginning that the message in this parable at its basic level is about being joyous and to celebrate the life restored to Christ rather than to be resentful. That the restored person is somehow not worthy or deserving of God's grace and mercy. So how do we respond to God's joy and not in resentment like the Pharisees and scribes? How do we make sure that we're responding in joy and not resentment? Because at its core, resentment is the feeling that another person has something that they don't deserve, or maybe they have more than you feel they deserve. And resentment comes out in things like jealousy and anger. And if it's not kept in check, it can be completely consuming to us. And it can take a huge hold on us. And unfortunately, it was a huge hold on the people in Jesus' time, and likewise in our time. as well. It's a driving factor in our culture today. I keenly remember one of my seminary professors saying this: the only cure for resentment is gratitude. The only cure for resentment is gratitude. And true, authentic gratitude is for the most part a learned response. Because we live in a life, in a world, that is all about number one. Take care of number one. And so gratitude is a learned response. It's what we teach our children. And what we need to continue to remind ourselves as adults and as a community of faith is to have gratitude and not resentment. You first need to learn to be grateful for what we have. Only then can we truly be grateful and rejoice with what others have. And then joy becomes a joy of celebration in community. Let me give you an example from this week in my life. I'm not prone to this. I too fight back and forth with gratitude and resentment because I'm human, just like you, believe it or not. So this week, a very, very busy schedule. And I haven't been on my bike for 2 weeks. And the weather was nice this week. And I couldn't get on my bike. I had a lot of things that needed me to be present at. My hubby got to go out a couple times, and I'm so grateful that he was able to go out and enjoy the weather and get on his bike and not feel that he had to stay home because I couldn't go. But I had to preach this sermon to myself on Friday afternoon, as the weather was really, really nice. And I was really running. I left my clinic an hour and 15 minutes early to go to Ryan to do a wedding rehearsal. And he was enjoying a beautiful ride. I was a little resentful. Maybe a whole bunch. But I literally was turning out of Marion onto Highway 13, and I said, you better start preaching your own sermon to yourself, Lynn. Be grateful for what you have. Be grateful that you have been called into lives to make a difference. Be grateful that you've been called to spread my word. It started changing my perspective. I was grateful and happy that he was able to do that, and I was becoming grateful and happy as I drove up the highway to be with this young couple and their family in an exciting time in their lives, to celebrate with them and not bemoan my pity party I was starting to have, right? It happens more than we want to maybe admit to or recognize. So there's this attitude of gratitude that we've been talking about in our worship community, in our committee meetings, that's kind of spawning up very organically out of our talks about how do we become more grateful? How do we show our gratitude within our church, within our community? And so, as the year unfolds, this phrase of attitude of gratitude is going to be coming at us in different ways. And for us to be able to participate in that, there's a thing called a reverse Advent calendar. You've seen Advent calendars, you open up the little door and you get a little chocolate or something. A reverse Advent calendar is giving instead of receiving. And so in the month of November, which is the Thanksgiving month, we're going to do a reverse calendar. And so every day we'll take one item out of our pantry and put it in our shopping bag so that when it comes to Thanksgiving worship, we can celebrate giving out of our gratitude. One thing each day as an attitude of gratitude, which will be our focus as we move on through this year. Because I know as we come to Thanksgiving and Black Friday specials and all the Christmas commercials that come on, sometimes we can get resentful Because all these commercials tell us what we're supposed to have, right? And maybe we can't have them. Maybe we probably just don't need them. But why do they get them and maybe I don't? And so we want to really put gratitude in front of us, to focus on giving rather than receiving. An attitude of gratitude, because that is the cure for resentment. Thanks be to God.